My name is Charles. I am a retired forester who has spent the better part of 3 decades working for the Law Enforcement and Investigations Division of the U.S. Forest Service. As you can imagine, with over 4 decades in service, I have an arsenal of stories and anecdotes to tell. But the one I'm going to tell you today really stuck with me, and I have rarely shared it with anyone. After all, these are not the kind of things we can talk about around the dinner table with our family or friends. Well, without further digression, this is the story of one of the scariest moments of my time as a ranger. For most of my career, I was assigned to Voyageurs National Park near the Canadian border. Since the park is bisected by a series of lakes, it is one of the most popular with anglers and kayakers. But these lakes are also populated by many small islands, many of which are excellent for camping. People often go to Voyageurs to get away from the city and get some privacy, and there is nothing more private than your own personal island. One afternoon, I got a call from a ranger chief asking me to do him a small favor. He had received a call from the International Falls Police Department, a small border town about 20 miles to the west. This, after an officer there had received a report of a missing person. A lady's husband had gone camping with an old friend and had not returned after leaving that morning. The husband was to head to his usual camping spot at a site called Wolf Island to see if they had moved on or not. The ranger team at Voyageurs National Park is probably one of the most amphibious in the country, definitely the most. Half of our job is to police the waterways and make sure all fishing and boating is within regulation, so not only do we have easy access to kayaks and motorboats, but we're pretty good at operating them. So as soon as I got the call, I headed to the Ash River Visitor Center, which is where we docked our boats. But then, just as I was getting the boat ready to sail to Wolf Island, I get a second call from the chief. The National Forest Protection Department had been in touch and had offered an update that I needed to be informed of immediately. According to the chief, it wasn't just a case of 2 fishermen who had fallen asleep after drinking too much beer, as the missing man's son had been in contact. And this time, it was to warn law enforcement that not only was his father most likely armed, but he had been acting extremely erratically before leaving for the camping trip. This was definitely not what I expected to hear when I was told there was an update, but I was more than equipped to deal with the situation since I was in law enforcement. On the other hand, instead of working solely at the visitor center, I had pretty much the same powers as the average police officer. But that didn't mean I didn't feel a sense of apprehension as to what. About 20 or 30 feet away there was a man sitting in a camping chair. Not quite upright, but not quite hunched over either. But this man had a huge hole in the top back of his skull, and one of the crows was poking its beak into that hole, while some others were fighting over what had spilled on the ground. The body in the chair belonged to one of our missing campers, but I didn't have to wait long to find the second one, as he was lying motionless next to the campfire. Or rather, he was what was left of the second camper. As I got closer, I realized that someone had made the effort to cut off his legs, I guess after he died. This person had carefully cut both legs off the corpse and divided them into small sections, which he then stuck in the fire. That is, what I had been smelling on the trail had not been a barbecue, but a good section of the second camper's legs sizzling in the campfire. I guess the guy in the chair didn't have the heart to finish disposing of his campmate and had decided to let nature take its course with both of them. We never found out what really happened, but we did find out that the killer, who was obviously the guy in the chair, had invited his friend on a camping trip to his usual spot, but had kept nothing from his wife or anyone else. Everyone knew where they were going and that they would be spending the weekend there, which led us to believe that his decision to kill his friend at the campground was spontaneous, or that he had planned to simply kill him before taking his own life, as a way to avoid any consequences. It was learned that the saddleman had murdered his friend with a shotgun blast to the chest. He obviously wanted to conceal the murder. Otherwise, he wouldn't have gone to the trouble of roasting and trying to roast his companion's body at the campfire. But I don't think he took the time to investigate how complex the disposal of a corpse was. This is one of the arguments that gives strength to the spontaneous murder theory, and that is that the perpetrator did not seem to be prepared or have a plan to dispose of the corpse. Instead, it seems that he just did the first thing that came to his mind after committing the act. Make a bonfire and try to burn the remains to ashes. Personally, I think the man acted in desperation when he realized what he had done and the consequences it would bring. But there was no accelerant at the scene, so the incineration process would be much slower than he expected. And when it became apparent that it was going to take too long and that the police might come looking for him or his dead friend before the disposal could be completed, he panicked and decided to end it all before he faced justice and probably the judgment of his victim's family. For as far as we knew, the two men had been friends for many years, and their families were very close. Although it is obvious, I must mention that the man in the chair took his own life by shooting himself in the mouth with the same shotgun with which he had taken the life of his friend, which was lying beside the chair and had only his own fingerprints on it. After this chilling event, there was a bit of a somber mood among the park staff for a while. As far as I knew, nothing like that had ever happened before, and nothing like that ever happened again for the rest of my career, because, as you can probably guess, these are not exactly high-crime areas. In the park, the most intense things usually happen at boating parties, when people abuse speed, and in that case, you can call the campers to attention and tell them to slow down. But to have something so terrible happen right under our noses had a really strong effect on our mood. During the weeks that followed, I kept thinking about what could have been going on in that guy's head to make him want to murder one of his best friends. Like I said, we didn't hear about any affair or betrayal or anything else that could have made the guy go crazy like that. It's all just one big mystery, and like so many other mysteries in life, but honestly, I think I'm much more comfortable living in ignorance. My cousin was a heterologist by training but served as a forester in the Montana and Wyoming area. She was passionate about her profession, so it's no wonder she often ventured into the most remote corners of the forest to analyze streams and snow runoff for contaminants. The idea of accompanying her on one of these expeditions seemed exciting to me, who at the time was 18 years old and in the middle of a vacation before starting college, so I didn't think twice about it when she proposed going with her on this one. We packed all our gear in saddlebags, preparing to camp in the woods for 2 nights. Now, this was something my cousin did regularly by trade. She was tough as nails and didn't flinch at the idea of sleeping in the middle of nowhere all alone. It was something almost routine at work for her, but I grew up camping and spending time outdoors as well, so you could say I was in my element too. But there was still something that had me a little nervous, and that was the isolation. We were going to be far away from anywhere, and there would be no help anywhere nearby, no family, no nothing. It was just me and her in miles and miles of treacherous forest. The first day was nothing short of magical. The scenery was breathtaking, the air so pure it was almost intoxicating. I felt like I was inhaling years of life with every breath. The tranquility of the forest was overwhelming in contrast to the hustle and bustle of city life. I fell in love with that area and was wishing I could visit more often. That first day was divided into 2 different activities. The first half of the day was mainly doing her work, which involved a lot of hiking on trails back and forth, a lot of back and forth in various parts of the forest collecting samples, and then carrying them back to camp. As we did so, she showed me all the ins and outs of her work, and once the job was done, we had to store all the samples in a hard case that seemed indestructible to take back to base the next day. The rest of the afternoon, my cousin took me around all the nearby viewpoints to show me the most beautiful views of the place. The day finally ended, and with the undulating illumination of the sunset, the walk back to our camp felt like being in a movie. Some of the trails were so narrow and looked so old and desolate, they looked like they hadn't been used in years. My cousin took me through a network of hunting trails that was well up the mountainside where we set up our camp, and upon arrival, we finally had this delicious dinner of sandwiches and Cheetos that I had been looking forward to all afternoon. Even though there was some pasta salad that we kept in a small cooler. This seemed like the perfect ending to an absolutely magical day. While we were eating dinner, my cousin took the time to give me even more information about the area. This was an almost untouched part of the park, as this patch of forest was so remote and access was so difficult that people just didn't explore. However, on this occasion, my cousin found evidence of some recent traffic. It seemed that some hunters had been there recently, as we found bullet casings in several places, Some of them were rusty, which showed that they had been fired for quite some time, but others were recent. We also found boot prints, and these appeared fresh. This was an unusual and disturbing find, but not so unusual as to rob an iron woman like my cousin of her peace of mind. "Tomorrow is going to be a fun day," she said. "We're going to pack up camp, and then I'll take you to Old Hans. There's something very particular I want to show you. I warn you, it's a bit spooky stuff, but I think you'll like it." With that, we went to bed that night. Frankly, I was very excited. I had visions in my head of the weird and spectacular things my cousin had in store for me tomorrow. At dawn the next day, my cousin turned to me with this mischievous gleam in her eyes. "Are you ready for this day?" she asked in a pleading tone, and I nodded. We finished with our camp chores, and then my cousin pulled out something I hadn't seen her before. It was a small backpack that was equipped with a rope, a flashlight, a first aid kit, a big knife, and a small black pistol that I didn't even know she had. He said it was a 9mm Beretta, and he carried it everywhere with him when he was out in the wilderness. With that, he took us in a direction not too far from camp that we had not yet gone to. This was a huge gully that was in another section of the mountain, but it was quite strange. It looked as if someone had dug a huge trench along the side of a mountain. Then my cousin took me towards some bushes that were nearby, and there she showed me the first surprise of the day. In that place there were 2 horses tied to a tree. I was very surprised to see them because she never mentioned anything about them. Seeing my surprised face, she smiled and told me that she had come with a companion a couple of days before, and they had left them there, with water and food, of course. I also saw that there was a kind of tarp set up between 2 trees that was like a tent, which was set up for the horses to water themselves at night. She told me that they used to use horses to access some of the more distant places they needed to get to in order to test the water, and that day we would ride them to take the next ride. Personally, I wasn't much of a horseman, so she had me saddle up behind her, and she led us across the hillside on her best horse. At the end, there was an isolated sheepfold on the mountain, where we dismounted our horse and tied up. My cousin then directed me to follow a narrow wildlife trail just beyond, and handed me our rechargeable radio to stay in touch. It was this little compact device that was also equipped with a flashlight that I could use if necessary, but only if necessary, to keep the battery from draining fast. This was his way of telling me to stay alert and in touch. I knew we were in a deep and isolated part of the forest where predators could lurk anywhere. That said, we said our goodbyes there, and she agreed to catch up with me in a little while, after collecting other samples in another small body of water nearby. I scanned the area and followed her instructions, but as I ventured down the path, I stumbled upon a sight that was completely out of place. In the middle of this forest was a huge coil of wire similar to the 10 or 12 gauge wiring used in houses. It was sticking out of the ground and completely discordant with the surrounding landscape. I stopped completely dumbfounded, thinking, how the hell could this be here? How did something like that get to this remote place, and what for? Then I realized that this must be what my cousin was talking about, the strange and creepy thing she was going to show me. I felt a mixture of uncertainty and disappointment, as I was expecting something much bigger and scarier. I realized that it probably wasn't even attached to anything, so I grabbed the wire and pulled on it, but to my utter surprise, it was actually inserted into the ground. I dug around in the dirt a bit to see how far it went, and discovered that the wire went into a pipe that was hidden with rocks and other things that could damage it. That's when I knew that this cable was really going somewhere, but being on a deserted mountainside, I had no idea where it might go. "What do you think?" my cousin asked as he came up behind me. "Very, very strange," I said. "Do you have any idea where it goes?" I asked immediately. "No, none of us do. Some of the other rangers told me they would find this here. I didn't think anything of it until I found the desk. It's got to be a hoax of some kind, probably some old joke from when the crews ran power lines through here." My cousin nodded and then shrugged. She then told me a story. The wire snaked its way through the brush, hung from tree branches and snaked around rocks, and finally ended at an outlet mounted on the side of a desk. The desk was reminiscent of the old ones from my school days. It was alone in the woods, no chair, no building, nothing else, just a lonely desk with a live outlet. Confused and curious, I watched as my cousin plugged the radio into the outlet, and to our amazement, the radio lit up and began playing static at full volume. Despite being miles away from civilization, with no road access, buildings, or people, we found a live outlet. The wire was being fed from somewhere, an unknown and invisible source. It was a complete enigma, a lone power table in the middle of the forest. I really regret not taking a picture of it, because it was as eerie a sight as it was inexplicable. Now, when my cousin first got this job, the other rangers told him that he would find a live wire in the middle of the mountain when he first went out to take samples. But it was a few months later, about 2 or 3 years earlier, that he found the wire and followed it to the desk. When he mentioned the desk to his colleagues, they all laughed as if he was making it up, but he was not. He didn't even have pictures to prove it. The other rangers were so impressed that they all planned to walk together just to see the crazy thing my cousin was talking about. But when they arrived, they realized that it was indeed still there, as it was that day when my cousin led me to it. No explanation, no hidden bodies, no legends about it, nothing. Just this unexplained anomaly in the heart of the forest. As I stared at the desk, totally stunned, something caught my attention. It was a small writing that had been carved into the wood. I wonder who carved that? I asked my cousin, pointing to the surface of the desk, where the carved phrase was. Then she walked over and looked at where I pointed, reading the message had been chiseled. "Go away forever." My cousin's eyes opened wide as I watched the color drain from her face, and what she said next sent shivers down my spine. She said that hadn't been there before, that she had just done this route only 2 months before and had never seen anyone else in the area, never in all her years with the Forest Service. We lingered there a little longer, listening to the sounds of the forest and looking around, but no one was there and nothing moved. She radioed her office and let them know that she was done where she was, and that we would return immediately. That sudden call to headquarters told me for sure that something strange was going on. After that, we immediately set out on our way back with the horses, arrived at camp, picked up all the work equipment intact, and started on our way back to civilization. As we were nearing the base, we began to see campers, hikers, and fishermen along the creek, all waving and smiling. Then I had this strange thought about that desk sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by nothing but miles of forest, and I imagined someone sitting there watching all the tourists use the recreation sites in the park below. It reminded me of the series Lost, or something like that. We got back safely, and my cousin and I never talked about it again. She still works for the Forest Service, but has moved to other areas of the state. I'm sure that desk is still up there, brimming with energy for no reason at all. I grew up in St. Louis, but moved to Knoxville after enrolling at the University of Tennessee. During the summer between freshman and sophomore year, I decided to enroll in a seasonal volunteer ranger program at nearby Great Smoky Mountains National Park. As a business management major, my career aspirations leaned more toward sitting behind a desk and stacking papers, but the romantic idea of being a park ranger had always fascinated me. Perhaps because of the allure of working outdoors, rescuing injured animals, and being surrounded by nature. Something I've loved since I was a kid because I grew up on a farm in a mountainous area. So when the opportunity arose to play the role of a ranger for a month, while donning my own campaign hat, I couldn't resist. For 7 long months, I looked forward to this adventure. However, my initial enthusiasm was met with a dose of reality. The seasonal volunteer program served primarily as a way to secure vacations for ranger crews. Understaffed, we were never entrusted with tasks that required actual experience. Most of the time, I and the other 2 volunteers found ourselves staffing the park visitor center. The remaining 40% of the time, we were assigned basic administrative work or boundary maintenance. Although this was not the exciting and exhilarating experience I had imagined, I preferred boundary maintenance duties to being cooped up inside. Boundary maintenance was essentially a fancy term for fence checking. My responsibilities involved walking long sections of boundary fence to make sure they were in good repair. It was during one of these walks that I met someone I would never forget, even after all these years. He was near Cosby Creek, located on the eastern boundary of the park, an area of particular importance during boundary checks because of an ancient burial ground called Tritt Cemetery. We needed to make sure that wildlife did not disturb the resting place of the departed, so after confirming that the fences around the cemetery were intact, I continued east along the fence for about 10 to 15 minutes. Suddenly, I saw movement ahead through the trees. The moment I laid eyes on the figure, I could not believe what I was seeing. It was as if my mind momentarily questioned the reality before me. The girl moving gently through the trees was in a horrible state. She was completely naked, her skin marred with clotted blood and dried blood. Every inch of her body, from her hair to her toes, was covered in blood. It was amazing that she could even stand up. Without a second's hesitation, I rushed into action. I approached her as she collapsed to the ground, took off my shirt, and used it to cover her as best I could, then gently lifted her up and carried her back to my truck. Fortunately, I had found her not too far from where I had parked. When I finally arrived, I was exhausted. Then I remembered that there was an urgent care center in Newport about 12 miles north of Cosby. I drove as fast as I could with the girl in the back seat, while constantly repeating, "Don't close your eyes, you have to stay awake." She kept her eyes wide open but remained silently staring at nothing until we finally arrived at the urgent care center. The medical staff immediately attended to her, and I explained the situation. It was here that my active role in this ordeal ended, but I kept an eye on her. Later, I was informed that the girl would be transferred to Seville, where there was a hospital with a better-equipped emergency room. I offered to help further, but was advised that the best course of action was to return to the head of the Rangers and inform him of the situation. When I walked into the Ranger headquarters covered in blood, the chief and my co-workers immediately sensed that something terrible had happened. At first, they thought I was the one who had been injured, but I assured them it was not my blood. I told them the facts immediately, and the chief took notes of everything that happened. Since we had jurisdiction, the onus was on us to investigate what had happened to the girl. The only other entity that could legally take over would be the FBI, either if we requested their assistance or if they decided to intervene on their own. Our team prepared to investigate, but that's when things took a strange turn. I needed to talk to the girl to understand what had happened, but when the chief contacted the hospital and we spoke to the doctors, we learned that she hadn't uttered a word since her arrival. She was not talking to the doctors, the nurses, or anyone else. This was not entirely surprising considering the trauma he must have suffered, but it complicated our efforts. The doctors advised us to return the next day in the hope that he might open up. We then waited until early afternoon the next day and called the hospital once again. However, to our dismay, the girl still refused to talk. The chief decided to visit the hospital and asked me to accompany him, hoping that my presence would encourage her to finally say something. We discussed the investigation during the trip to the hospital, not realizing the strange turn things were about to take. When we arrived, we found the nursing staff in a state of panic. It took a while to figure out what had happened, but when we did, we were shocked beyond belief. The hospital had requested our victim's surveillance camera footage. They revealed a man dressed in hospital gowns pushing a wheelchair through the hospital's main entrance just after 1:15 p.m. He was carrying some sort of ID clip. He was wearing some sort of ID clip and managed to bypass the reception desk by heading straight to the girl's room, put her in the wheelchair, and wheeled her out of the hospital without any interference from staff. This was a massive breach of hospital protocols, but without any information about the young woman or her apparent abductor, our options were very limited. The only course of action was to involve the FBI, as we feared that the person who had taken the girl from the hospital might be connected to her initial situation. We hoped this would lead to a full investigation. However, when we followed up with the FBI about a month later, we were met with disappointment. Someone higher up in the office had decided that the case was not worth pursuing. They were not interested in allocating resources to a case where the main charge might be impersonating a healthcare professional. It seemed that without hard evidence or testimony from the girl, the case had reached a dead end. I was not satisfied with this outcome. If it were up to me, I would have pursued this case to the ends of the earth to find out what had happened to that poor girl. But it wasn't up to me. I wasn't even a full-fledged ranger. So the moment my volunteer stint was over, I went back to my studies, but I never forgot what I had witnessed. Years later, when I felt the time was right, I decided to share this haunting story with my daughter. It may seem strange to share such a frightening and strange story with a teenager, but I believe there was a lesson to be learned. When I returned to Ranger headquarters after dropping the girl off at the urgent care center, I had assumed that the Ranger team and other law enforcement agencies would fight tirelessly to bring her attackers to justice. What I learned, however, was that the world was not always as fair and simple as I had once believed. Sometimes even those entrusted with our protection could act with indifference and even negligence. It was a hard lesson to learn, but I wanted my daughter to understand that life could be unpredictable and that justice was not always guaranteed, that monsters do exist, but they come in various forms, and sometimes justice could be blurred by corruption and bureaucracy. In the modern world, justice seems to be more about paperwork and budgets than the actual doing of justice. It was a hard but sobering realization that I hoped would prepare my daughter for the adversities she may face these days, and also to always look out for her own safety under any circumstances. My days are usually filled with routine chores, trail maintenance, wildlife monitoring, and providing assistance to the occasional lost hiker. But this particular summer a few years ago was very different. The heat was oppressive even for a season. Rangers like myself pounded relentlessly, making every step feel like a titanic task. My colleagues and I were restless, begging for anything to break the monotony, and that's when we received the report that several cars had been seen entering and leaving the south side of the park, and some visitors claimed to be seeing individuals en masse running along the roads. At first, we thought it was just some college students filming a project or a group of thrill seekers doing some sort of challenge. But as those sightings continued, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something else was going on. Our supervisor, this grizzled old ranger named Alan, called a meeting to discuss the situation. We gathered around the map table, drinking coffee and exchanging theories. Some thought it might be a group of poachers. Others thought it was just a prank gone wrong. But Alan had a hunch it was something more sinister, so he proposed that we split up into patrols, do a complete survey of the park, and cover all the trails and roads to get to the bottom of this mystery. There were a lot of us in that off-season, so we had a good manpower to conduct a thorough investigation from top to bottom of the park and comb it from one side to the other. We couldn't check every little side road, but gradually we were able to see all the major roads and intersections. Also the parking lots and campgrounds, the places that could hold a lot of traffic, cars, and people. For this job, I was paired with my colleague Rochelle, an experienced ranger with a good eye for detail. We sat in our van armed with water, snacks, and a good dose of skepticism. The sun was beating down on us as we drove. The radio crackled with static, and as we ventured deeper, Rochelle and I had our own theories. I was convinced that this was some sort of poaching scenario. The reported sightings were just a picture in my head, guys in pickup trucks and with their backsides covered to carry kill bases in case we found them. There is a lot of game in these small valleys throughout the park: antelope, sheep, deer of all kinds, and other wildlife. But these are protected, and hunting them in the forest is completely illegal. Rochelle, on the other hand, thought it was gang activity or some other such nefarious situation, but it was just conjecture as none of us had any evidence of it. However, this was all we talked about on the road. As we patrolled, the silence was truly eerie. There seemed to be no birds singing, no insects buzzing, just the hum of our engine and the soft crunch of gravel under our tires. We saw no other signs of life, no indication of what we were looking for, just an endless expanse of forest stretching like a steep hill. We stopped at each trailhead, scanning the horizon for any sign of human activity. Rochelle checked the maps, keeping an eye out for anything that might attract the riffraff. I, for my part, looked extensively for any signs of recent human activity, human or tire tracks, anything that might indicate someone had been there recently and give us a head start between the map and the landscape. But we found nothing. However, there were 20 teams scouring through the lowlands, so Rochelle and I, we were only looking for a small part of the park, so just because we didn't find anything, it didn't mean the same for the others. It was just a matter of waiting. Hours passed and the sun climbed higher in the sky, but we still found nothing. No sign of life, no sign of trouble. Just the deserted forest, waiting patiently for us to find out what was going on out here. After a while, though, Rachel and I ran out of things to do. We were circling through the same trailheads, checking the same back roads, but there was no sign of anything out there, and we were starting to get hungry and were low on fuel, so we decided that if we went back to base, repo would be ourselves and the truck, then maybe we could get orders for a different area. As we drove back to the station, the radio crackled vividly, and Alan's voice came over in his very serious tone. All patrols be advised. We received another report of individuals en masse, this time near the old mine shaft. Proceed with caution. Rachel and I exchanged a look of alarm. This was getting serious. We stepped on the gas. Our van was now accelerating towards the mine shaft, and we were ready to face whatever was up ahead. Alan sounded terrible over the radio, so we really didn't know what to expect or what to think. When we arrived at the mine shaft, the other rangers were already scouring the area. Their vans were parked around the entrance, and we joined the search. Our eyes scanned the dusty ground for any sign of these individuals en masse. But there was nothing. Not a sign of them. There was no sign of any recent human activity, just the remains of previous visitors. Cigarette butts, drink bottles, and all sorts of other trash, but still, it was spooky. The mine was this old gully dropping right down from the top of the hillside, but it was clear that whoever had been here before, it wasn't a recent thing. Among the things we saw scattered around the place, there was a wooden frame on one part of the staircase that led straight down into the darkness, but beyond that, it had simply all collapsed. There might be small offshoots where a person could hide, but there was no way we were going there to look for someone who didn't need help, as it was too dangerous. Rochelle and I exchanged a look of disappointment. Our initial excitement was waning now. It seemed our theory about the college kids was correct. Some art project or prank was what they seemed to be up to in this place. One fellow suggested we leave a couple of rangers behind to watch the place just for a few hours, just in case. 2 rangers volunteered to stay behind the rest of us. The rest of us loaded into our vans and were ready to head back to the main base. But as we rounded a bend, a voice crackled over the radio. "We got a vehicle parked behind some rocks at the dog camp. Looks suspicious." It was Alan. At that point, we were coming down the steep hill that mine was on and had a great vantage point of the area on the south side of the park, including a couple of the outlying camps. One of the rear rangers, while looking down from the cliff, spotted a vehicle hidden in one of these camps, so our convoy quickly reoriented. We began the long, slow descent down the hillside towards that camp. This area was notorious for attracting undesirables and troublemakers who thought they could escape the law by venturing into the far reaches of the park. The campground was a hotspot for illegal activity, so we approached it with caution, which is why we turned into the dog camp. There was always some dog around. It was usually harmless, but still, you can never be too safe. As we entered the campground, our eyes scanned the area, noticing scattered trash and an abandoned camping gear. The car was parked behind a group of rocks and partially hidden. Our boots continued to crunch on the gravel as we began to investigate the area. The first thing I noticed was that the car was not running, and was now black and white due to being burned out and very little of its original bodywork was left, but I assumed it was black. None of us wanted to go near it. Obviously something was seriously going on there. Alan immediately called the local sheriff's department and asked the deputies to get to the scene right away, then sent a couple of us back to the precinct building so they could take the law enforcement officers back to the crime scene we had just discovered. At that point, the air became heavy and there was an ominous silence throughout, the only sound being the rustling trees and the distant hum of the wind. Rochelle and I walked the perimeter, scanning the ground for any sign of activity. The sun continued to fall on us, casting these long shadows across the dusty ground again. No one wanted to go near that car, so we just knocked around looking for any other clues, which is how we noticed that there were shell casings in a large chopping log that had some cuts made like with a machete or a large knife, as well as something dark that we didn't know what it was. Maybe some of the black smoke produced by the car as it burned. We really didn't know what to make of it. Every step seemed like a nightmare in slow motion, as if we were being watched by invisible eyes. It was as if the trees hovering over us. There was definitely something very dark in that place. I just couldn't shake that feeling that we were falling into some kind of trap, that something or someone was waiting for us, just out of sight to attack at any moment. But this was probably due to the uncomfortable tension that had built up in that place, because it was clear that we were facing something macabre. You could feel it. As we approached the car, I noticed that it was old, rusted and covered with this thick layer of dust. The windows were blown out, leaving long, jagged shards in the frame. I tried to move the door handle, but it was melted in place, and it was impossible for it to work. Rachel and I looked at each other again with wide eyes. Our instincts were screaming loudly that something was very wrong. We began to circle the car, looking for any sign of entering or exiting the woods, and that's when I saw it. It was what looked like a head resting on the front seat. I froze in place, and it was only after a few seconds of shock that I screamed for everyone to come and see what we had found. Alan slowly approached my side, and my heart began to race as I yelled out to the others, "We got something here." "What is that, man?" I said to Alan with my voice louder than normal, almost screaming from nerves. He then told me to stop yelling and try to calm down. I apologized and pointed to what I was looking at. Then Alan peeked over my shoulder and took a deep breath. I took a few steps back so he could see a little better, because I was sure he hadn't been able to make out the eerie image in front of us as well as I could. But just one more step was all it took. Alan was just as frozen when he could see the corpse for what it was. This man, woman, or whatever, was not only burned to a crisp, but methodically dissected like a frog on a 6th grade science lab table. It was hard to tell what was what, but it looked like someone had torn this person apart before setting him and his car on fire. We all backed out of the car and tried to calm down, but at this point we were desperate for the sheriff to arrive, which was at least an hour. I wish I could say we got answers and the relief we wanted, but we did not. When the law arrived, they surrounded it with yellow tape and started taking pictures. But when we explained the condition of the body and they saw it, their whole demeanor seemed to change. They dismissed us and said they would get back to us if they had any further questions. When we went back to check the scene the next day, that vehicle was gone, as was all the trash in the area. We received the official report a few weeks later, and we were all completely stunned. The conclusion they came to was that it was a suicide. According to the report, the man had sat in the passenger seat of the vehicle and then set it on fire, but before that, someone had laid him down and removed his arms and legs with a wood chopping axe. That probably explained the chopped log we saw with those dark spots on top. However, this didn't make any sense. If it really was suicide, how was it he cut off his own limbs, got in the car, put on his seatbelt, and then set himself on fire? Alan, the district leader, said there was a lot of illegal drug dealing in the area and it had to be related. Didn't any other scenario make sense? It was clear that this was not the real cause of death, but it was a quick way to close a case that the sheriffs were not too keen to investigate. There were not going to be any leads or breakthroughs in a case like this, and beyond that, it was a very dangerous thing to do. This was a watershed experience for our department. That year, many people moved to different parks and undertook different occupations. After all, dying murdered on the edge of the world was not in the job description, and many of us felt we were moments away from walking to our own deaths that day. Me too, although I stayed with the district and still work in that unforgiving place to this day. I have many strange and cool stories to tell, but this is definitely the darkest thing that ever happened to me on the job. I've always been fascinated by forests. There is a magic in those places, an ancestral energy that envelops you and makes you feel tiny, but at the same time, part of something much bigger. Ever since I was a kid, I dreamed of being a forest ranger. My grandfather was a ranger and my father was also a ranger for a while, so I had the profession in my veins, probably because I spent a lot of time outdoors accompanying both my father and grandfather in their activities in the forest. Since then, I dreamed of living surrounded by giant trees and wild creatures. And guess what? I made it. Here I am, in the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, fulfilling my dream. But while I love my job and thoroughly enjoy the outdoors and even the solitude, it's not all peace and quiet in these forests. There are stories that are passed down from generation to generation, legends that speak of mysterious creatures and spirits that inhabit these places. At first, I took them as simple tales to scare tourists, but after what I experienced, I began to believe that maybe there was some truth in them. It was a cold and wet night, one of those when the fog envelops everything and the trees seem to whisper secrets. I was patrolling an area away from the main trails, a place that visitors usually avoid, and to which not much attention was paid, but that day it was part of the perimeter that I had to cover. The moon was hiding behind the clouds and the darkness was so thick that I could barely see a step away from me. That's when I heard a strange noise, like a muffled moan coming from deep in the forest. I became on my guard. I had been patrolling these woods long enough to know that this was not the sound of trees. My heart was beating a mile a minute. Could it be a wild animal? Or maybe just the wind playing with the branches? I decided to approach carefully, guided by the sound. As I advanced, the moaning became louder and clearer. I stopped in front of an old oak tree. Its trunk was twisted by the passage of time, and at the base of the tree, there was a small cave and the sound was coming from inside. With the flashlight in my hand, I went into the darkness. The cave was small and damp, with the walls covered with moss. I was trying to be cautious in case there were any animals in there, so I did not go inside, but shone the light from the entrance, and it was then that I could faintly make out a figure sitting on the ground, wrapped in some kind of dark blanket. At first, I thought it was a wanderer who had gotten lost, but when the figure turned toward me, I was petrified. He was a tall, thin man, his face pale, too pale. We made eye contact and both of us were silent for a few seconds. I have never been superstitious, but for some reason his presence felt strange, unnatural, so I froze instantly. But suddenly, one of us broke the silence. He said, "You shouldn't be here." His voice sounded thick and raspy. "This is my place, not yours." I felt a shiver run down my spine. I didn't know who this man was, but his presence intimidated me. I tried to calm him down, explaining that I was just doing my job, but he spoke again. "This is my place, not yours." He repeated with his voice louder now. Before I could react, the man jumped up and started running towards me. At that moment, I was filled with panic. I backed up and started running. You could feel his footsteps running behind me. My heart was racing and my head felt like an espresso pot. Who was this man? What was he doing in that place and why was he chasing me? I looked ahead and saw my truck parked, so I picked up the pace to get to it before this man could catch up with me. However, when I was about 10 meters away, I felt the footsteps behind me stop. I didn't stop, and I didn't stop until I got to the car, and once there I opened the door, got in, and for some reason before starting the engine, I looked towards the front, where I had just left from, and that's when I could distinguish this huge dark shadow between the trees. It was about 8 feet tall, really gigantic. Just as I had thought before, it was completely unnatural. At that moment I decided to start the car, and the lights illuminated the forest completely in a second, and to my surprise it was gone. It had vanished. I was completely paralyzed for a few moments. Then I put the car in reverse and returned as fast as I could to the base, with my heart still racing and completely bewildered. The next day I returned to the place where everything had happened, but I found no trace of the man or the cave, as if it had never existed. As I said before, they are full of legends. I've heard a few since I started on the job, but none that resembled whatever it was I saw that night. I couldn't tell if it was some sort of spirit of someone who passed away in these woods, but to be honest, I think it was something else, something non-human. The truth is that since that night I only patrol that area during the day, and still I can't help but feel uneasy and fearful that someday I might run into that creature again.